My mother paid a mechanic to sabotage my car brakes and was waiting at the exact accident site, filming everything to become the heroine who saved me. The airbag exploded against my face with brutal force while the deafening sound of metal twisting against concrete tore through my eardrums. And in those eternal seconds, when my dark blue sedan spun uncontrollably on the wet road after the brakes completely failed on a curve at 80 kilometers per hour, all I could think was that Regina, my mother, had miraculously arrived 3 minutes earlier at the exact spot where my car would skid. There she was, standing on the shoulder with her imported white SUV, already dialing emergency numbers on her phone even before my vehicle stopped spinning. Her green eyes fixed on me through the shattered windshield with an expression that mixed performative maternal concern with something far more sinister: satisfaction. My 38 years of life, meticulously constructed to maintain a safe distance from the woman who transformed love into obsessive control, were about to collapse in a revelation that would prove that not even changing cities, switching my number 3 times, and limiting contact to obligatory holiday gatherings had been enough to escape Regina's psychological clutches, who was now running toward me, dramatically shouting, "My daughter! I knew something terrible would happen. My mother's heart brought me here." The throbbing pain in my head competed with the growing nausea as I tried to process the statistical impossibility of Regina being on that exact deserted stretch of road on a Thursday at 3 in the afternoon, when she lived 40 kilometers away and supposedly didn't know my new route to work since I changed jobs 6 months ago. But there she was, opening my crushed car door with superhuman strength that only mothers in heroic mode can manifest, her perfectly styled blonde hair not even disheveled by the light rain that was starting to fall. Her impeccable red lipstick as she pulled me by the arms, shouting instructions to paramedics who hadn't even arrived yet. "Don't worry, my love. Mommy is here. I'll always be here to save you," she repeated like a mantra. Loud enough for the first onlookers stopping their cars to hear and witness the cinematic moment of a mother heroically saving her ungrateful daughter, who had tried to distance herself. Through the fog of confusion and pain, I realized Regina was narrating the events to the growing spectators as if she were a reporter covering her own story of heroism. "I had a terrible premonition this morning," she proclaimed to anyone who would listen, holding my hand with unnecessary force as I tried to sit up. "A mother always knows when her child is in danger. I canceled all my appointments and drove down this road. Something told me Sophia would need me. And look, I arrived just in time to see her lose control of the car. If I hadn't been here, who knows what might have happened." The narrative was so perfectly constructed, so convenient in its details, that even in my altered state of consciousness, psychological alarm bells began ringing louder than the actual sirens of the approaching ambulance. How did she know I would be on this specific road? Why was she filming with her phone since before the accident? And most importantly, why didn't she seem the least bit surprised by what had happened? Miguel arrived at the hospital 20 minutes after me, his normally calm face transfigured by panic, sweat running down his forehead despite the cold air conditioning in the emergency room. "Sophia! Thank God you're okay," he exclaimed, hugging me carefully to avoid hurting my superficial wounds, his dark eyes scanning my face for signs of serious trauma. But before we could exchange more words, Regina intervened between us with the authority of someone who possesses territorial rights over my existence. "She's fine thanks to me," she declared, her tone leaving no room for questioning. If I hadn't followed my maternal intuition and been in that exact location, our Sophia might be dead now. A husband can love Miguel, but only a mother has that sixth sense that saves lives. The way she emphasized our Sophia and diminished Miguel's role in my life with casual cruelty was typical of her tactics to maintain herself as a central and indispensable figure. But there was something different this time, an excessive confidence, as if she knew that after this event, her position in my life would be eternally cemented. Dr. Patricia, the emergency physician who examined me, was a competent 47-year-old woman with red hair, tied in a practical bun, and blue eyes that conveyed professionalism, mixed with genuine compassion. "Mrs. Sophia, your injuries are surprisingly mild considering the severity of the accident," she observed while reviewing the test results. "Bruises, a superficial cut on the forehead, possible mild concussion. You were very lucky." Regina immediately inserted herself into the conversation. "It wasn't luck, doctor. It was divine intervention through maternal love. I saved my daughter. I pulled her from the car seconds before it caught fire." Dr. Patricia frowned. "The car caught fire?" There's no mention of that in the firefighter's report. Regina was unfazed. "It almost caught fire. It could have. The important thing is that I was there." The doctor gave me a questioning look, clearly perceiving that there were complex family dynamics at play, but too professional to comment beyond a subtle. Well, the important thing is that you're safe now. I was discharged from the hospital that night with instructions for rest and observation, but the real trauma was only beginning to reveal itself. While Miguel drove cautiously home with me in the passenger seat, Regina followed us in her SUV, high beams reflecting in the rearview mirror like vigilant eyes that never blinked. "She's acting even stranger than normal," Miguel muttered, his voice tense. "How did she know where you would be? That's not even your usual route." I had thought the same thing. I normally took the main highway, but today had impulsively decided to try the secondary road to avoid traffic. I hadn't told anyone, not even Miguel. "And there's more," he continued. "Carlos from the repair shop called me. Said your car had its maintenance done last week. How did the brakes simply fail?" Miguel's words verbalized suspicions I was trying to repress, thoughts so disturbing that my mind refused to process them completely. Regina insisted on spending the night at our house, to take care of my heroically saved daughter, completely ignoring our polite protest that we were fine and just needed to rest. She settled into the guest room as if it were her home. She had even already brought a suitcase that was conveniently in her car. During the early morning hours, unable to sleep due to headache and growing uneasiness, I got up to get water and found her in the living room, speaking on the phone in a low but excited voice. "Yes, it worked perfectly," she whispered. "Now she can never push me away again. I saved her life, everyone saw. I'm the heroic mother who was in the right place at the right time. Miguel is nothing compared to this." My blood ran cold. I tried to convince myself that I had misunderstood, that the concussion was making me imagine things, but the following words destroyed any illusion. The mechanic did exactly as instructed. The brake fluid was gradually drained, programmed to empty completely at that specific curve. I silently retreated to the bedroom, my heart beating so hard I feared Regina might hear it. Miguel was awake, sitting on the bed with his laptop open, his face illuminated by the screen showing an expression of absolute horror. "Sophia," he whispered, turning the screen toward me. I got the security camera footage from the gas station near home. The video showed Regina talking to a man in overalls, clearly a mechanic, beside my car, 3 days ago while I was at work. She was handing him something that looked like money, pointing to the wheels of my vehicle, and the man nodded in agreement. "My God, Miguel," I managed to whisper, my legs trembling so much I had to sit down. My own mother tried to kill me so she could save me. The police investigation began discreetly the following morning, after Miguel insisted on filing a police report despite my reservations about accusing my own mother of attempted homicide. The Lieutenant Oliveira, an experienced 44-year-old investigator with eyes that had seen too much of humanity's dark nature, listened to our story with professional skepticism that gradually transformed into genuine concern as we presented the evidence. "Cases of Munchausen syndrome by proxy usually involve children," he observed, taking meticulous notes. "But I've seen cases where controlling mothers create dangerous situations to keep adult children dependent. You said you had been trying to distance yourself from her?" I explained years of controlling behavior, emotional manipulation, the changes of city, the attempts to establish boundaries that only seemed to intensify Regina's obsession with being the center of my life. She always said I was ungrateful, that one day I would need her and understand that a mother is forever, I confessed, tears finally flowing. I think she decided to create that day. Carlos, the mechanic who owned the shop where I always took my car, was located and interrogated 2 days later. An honest 53-year-old man who had built a solid reputation over 3 decades of work. He completely crumbled when confronted with the security footage. Mrs. Regina approached me saying her daughter was suffering from depression, with suicidal tendencies. He confessed between sobs, his brown eyes full of remorse. She said she needed to create a controlled situation where she could intervene and save you, give you a reason to live again. She assured me she would be there to prevent anything serious, that the brakes would fail gradually, giving you time to slow down. He had been emotionally manipulated, convinced that he was helping to prevent a suicide, rather than causing a potentially fatal accident. She paid $20,000 in cash, said it was a small price to save her daughter. I believed her. My God, what have I done? Regina was arrested on a rainy Saturday morning, 2 police officers discreetly arriving at our house where she was still taking care of me. The transformation in her face when she saw the handcuffs was frightening, from concerned mother to cornered beast in seconds. "You can't do this!" she screamed, her voice completely losing the veneer of maternal composure. "I saved her life. Everyone saw. I'm a heroine, not a criminal. When she realized her protests were useless, she turned to me with eyes that burned with betrayal and anger. You've always been ungrateful, Sophia. Everything I did was out of love. You needed to remember that you need me, that without your mother, you are nothing. Lieutenant Oliveira interrupted her, reading her rights while escorting her to the police car, but she continued shouting, "One day you'll understand. When you're alone and abandoned, you'll wish you had the mother who moved heaven and earth to be with you." The public revelation of the case caused shockwaves in our community. Neighbors who had witnessed Regina's heroic rescue now reassessed what they had seen in a disturbing new light. Teresa, our 69-year-old neighbor who had lived on the same street for decades, approached me with information that had gained new sinister significance. "Your mother was here several days in a row last week," she revealed, her voice gentle but concerned. "She would stand at the corner for hours, observing your schedule, noting when you left and which route you took. I thought it was strange, but assumed it was just a mother missing her daughter." The puzzle pieces fit into an increasingly terrifying picture. Regina had meticulously planned every detail, studied my routes, calculated the exact moment the brakes would fail, positioned herself strategically for her moment of manufactured maternal glory. The trial would be in 3 months, and Regina's lawyer was already building a defense based on temporary insanity caused by extreme maternal love and pathological empty nest syndrome. Part of me, the daughter who still existed beneath layers of trauma and self-preservation, wanted to believe she was sick, that it wasn't pure evil but love distorted by mental illness. But then I remembered the calculating coldness of the plan, the meticulous manipulation of Carlos, the detailed study of my movements, and especially that expression of satisfaction when she saw me spinning out of control on that wet road. She wasn't saving my life. She was choreographing a performance where she would eternally be the heroine, and I would eternally be the daughter who owes her life to her mother. Miguel became my rock during this impossible period, but even our solid marriage showed cracks under the weight of maternal betrayal. "How do you trust anyone again after this?" he asked one night, holding my hand while I trembled with recurring nightmares of failing brakes. If a mother is capable of that, anyone is capable of anything. I had no answer. Regina had broken something fundamental in my ability to trust, leaving me questioning every gesture of kindness, every offer of help, every expression of concern. I began intensive therapy with Dr. Ana Lucia, a specialist in family trauma, who helped me understand that what Regina had done wasn't love, had never been love, but an obsession with control, disguised with the sacred mask of motherhood. During a particularly difficult session, Dr. Ana Lucia asked me a question that would haunt me for weeks. "Sophia, do you realize that she wasn't trying to kill you, but something worse? She was trying to break you psychologically so completely that you would never try to distance yourself again. The accident was meant to be your trauma, and she would eternally be your savior. It's a way of imprisoning someone more effective than bars." The truth of those words hit me like the accident itself. Regina had tried to turn me into a permanent emotional hostage, someone who would live the rest of her life indebted to the heroic mother who had miraculously been in the right place to save her. It was diabolical in its distorted genius, using the accident as psychological chains that I would never be able to break. The evidence continued to emerge as the investigation progressed. Regina's cell phone, seized by the police, revealed detailed searches for controlled brake failure, non-fatal car accidents, and disturbingly, hero syndrome in mothers. There was also a digital diary, where she documented her frustrations with my cruel distancing, and fantasized about scenarios where I would desperately need her. An entry from 2 months before the accident said, "Sophia thinks she can live without me. I need to remind her that mother is forever. I need to be essential in her life again. If she doesn't come for love, she'll come for necessity." It was a written confession of premeditation, destroying any temporary insanity defense her lawyer might build. The morning after the phone confrontation with Carlos was marked by a decision that would definitively change the course of the entire investigation, and especially solidify my determination to seek justice for the crimes committed against me. I woke before dawn with a mental clarity I hadn't felt in weeks, as if Carlos's veiled threat had paradoxically dissipated the fog of doubt and guilt that obscured my judgment about the seriousness of the situation. Miguel was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, his red eyes from fatigue revealing that he had spent the entire night researching legal precedents on cases similar to ours, compiling additional evidence that could strengthen our position in the approaching criminal case. "Sophia, I found something you need to see." he said without preamble when he saw me enter the kitchen, turning the computer screen toward me. Carlos Mendez da Costa has a criminal record in 3 different states. Always the same pattern. He seduces older women with financial resources, convinces them to commit crimes or transfer properties, then disappears when the situation becomes unsustainable. The revelation about Carlos's criminal history completely transformed my perception of Regina, who went from calculating perpetrator to victim of a professional predator who had identified her emotional vulnerabilities and systematically exploited them during 2 years of a fabricated relationship. The local news stories that Miguel had discovered through meticulous research in digital archives told disturbingly similar stories. Women between 55 and 70, all recently widowed or divorced, all with some accumulated assets or access to financial resources through relatives, all seduced by a charming man who appeared in their lives promising late love and companionship in their senior years. In each case, Carlos had used slightly different names, but always maintaining the initials CM, Carlos Martins, Cesar Mendez, Cayo Montenegro, a criminal arrogance that suggested he considered himself untouchable by the judicial system, or simply didn't care about the consequences of his predatory acts. "We need to take this immediately to Lieutenant Oliveira," I declared, already picking up my phone to call the police station. "This completely changes the nature of the case. We're not just dealing with an isolated attempt to create a heroic rescue situation, but with a serial criminal who repeatedly uses the same modus operandi." Miguel agreed, already printing all the documents he had discovered during his night research, organizing them chronologically to demonstrate the clear pattern of predatory behavior that Carlos had established over at least a decade. Each documented case followed the same sinister progression: initial seduction with exaggerated displays of affection and attention, gradual isolation of the victim from their family and social support network, introduction of urgent financial problems that could only be solved through drastic measures, and finally, the execution of crimes that invariably resulted in devastating financial losses for the victims and their families. The meeting with Lieutenant Oliveira that afternoon revealed that the police had already begun investigating Carlos's past independently, but our discoveries significantly accelerated the process and mainly provided crucial connections between cases that had been treated in isolation across different jurisdictions. "This is exactly what we needed to establish a clear criminal pattern," said the lieutenant, examining the documents with renewed professional interest. "With this evidence, we can request broader search warrants, and most importantly, we can contact the other victims to build a federal case against Carlos for criminal conspiracy and ongoing fraud." The possibility of transforming our isolated case into part of a broader federal investigation offered not only a greater likelihood of severe conviction for Carlos, but also the opportunity to prevent him from victimizing other vulnerable women in the future. During the following weeks, the investigation expanded dramatically as other victims of Carlos began to be located and interviewed by the task force that had been specifically assembled to handle what was now recognized as a sophisticated criminal operation that had caused millions in damages over the years. Each new victim who came forward told a painfully familiar story. The same initial charm, the same stories about promising businesses that needed just a financial push to take off, the same veiled threats when victims began questioning where the money was going. A 67-year-old lady from a neighboring state had lost her entire retirement and the house she had inherited from her parents. Another 71-year-old had been convinced to take out $1 million life insurance policy with Carlos as the beneficiary, narrowly escaping a potentially fatal fate when family members intervened. The most disturbing discovery was that in at least 2 previous cases, Carlos had used exactly the same strategy he tried with me, creating controlled accidents, from which the victims or their family members would be heroically saved, establishing an emotional debt that would be exploited indefinitely. One of the victims, the daughter of a woman Carlos had seduced 5 years earlier, reported that her mother had miraculously appeared to save her from an armed robbery that was later discovered to have been staged by Carlos's associates. Another told of a suspicious fire in her apartment from which she was rescued by her mother's dedicated boyfriend, who coincidentally was passing by the building at the exact moment the flames began. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Carlos not only financially exploited his victims, but created situations of real danger to establish psychological control through manufactured gratitude. Regina was officially reclassified from principal perpetrator to secondary victim in the case files, a legal change that recognized that, although she had actively participated in the crime against me, She had been systematically manipulated by a professional criminal who had exploited her specific emotional vulnerabilities. The discovery that Carlos had extensively researched Regina's life before approaching her, including details about our troubled relationship, my attempt to establish distance, and especially her obsessive desire to remain relevant in my life, demonstrated calculated premeditation that went far beyond a simple opportunistic scam. He had identified in Regina the perfect combination of emotional resources and physical access that he needed to execute his most ambitious plan yet. During this period of expanding investigation, I began receiving calls from Regina from the psychiatric clinic where she was still interned, but now with a completely different tone from her previous manipulation attempts. The medication and intensive therapy had begun to clear her perception about what had really happened, and each call revealed new levels of horror as she progressively understood how she had been used as a tool in an elaborate criminal scheme. "Sophia, my God, what have I done?" she sobbed during a particularly emotional call. "He made me believe you were in danger, that bad people were trying to take you away from me, that only through dramatic gestures could I prove my maternal love. How was I so blind? How did I allow him to turn me into a criminal?" The family therapy sessions that Dr. Fernanda had suggested began 3 months after the accident, with Regina still hospitalized but sufficiently stabilized to participate in structured conversations about the shared trauma we had experienced. The first sessions were extremely difficult, with Regina oscillating between paralyzing guilt and residual attempts to justify her actions through maternal love, while I struggled to process the legitimate anger I felt without letting it completely consume me. The goal here is not necessarily forgiveness or reconciliation, Dr. Fernanda explained during a particularly tense session. It's to create a safe space where both of you can process the trauma, understand the manipulation mechanisms that were used against you, and especially prevent similar patterns from repeating in the future. The most painful revelation came when Regina finally described in detail how Carlos had gradually distorted her perception of reality over 2 years of systematic manipulation. He had begun by planting small seeds of doubt about my intentions, suggesting that my withdrawal was not a search for healthy independence, but the influence of people who wanted to separate me from her. Then he evolved to fabricating evidence that I was in dangers that only she could perceive because of her maternal instinct. He went as far as creating fake profiles on social media to send anonymous threatening messages that he later discovered, and showed Regina as proof that I needed constant protection. "He made me believe that the whole world was conspiring to hurt you and that only I could save you," Regina explained, her voice broken by medication and the weight of understanding. "He transformed my love for you into paranoia, and my paranoia into criminal action." Carlos's trial took place 6 months after the accident, in a federal courthouse packed with media representatives who had transformed the case into a national symbol of the dangers of romantic predators who target vulnerable women. The process lasted 2 intense weeks during which 17 victims or victims' family members testified about Carlos's crimes, creating a devastating mosaic of manipulation, exploitation, and psychological violence that had left a trail of financial and emotional destruction across multiple states. My testimony was particularly impactful because I had physically survived what could have been a fatal accident, offering concrete evidence that Carlos was willing to risk human lives to maintain his control over victims. "The defendant is not just a common scammer," argued the prosecution in their closing statements. "He is a calculating predator who identifies women at vulnerable moments in their lives, meticulously studies their emotional weaknesses, and then exploits these vulnerabilities with surgical precision. He doesn't just steal money, he destroys family relationships, annihilates his victims' self-esteem, and as we've seen in Sofia Santos's case, is willing to create life-threatening situations to maintain his psychological control." The prosecutor, a determined 50-year-old woman who had specialized in cases of domestic violence and financial exploitation, presented the evidence with devastating clarity that left no doubt about Carlos's predatory nature and dangerousness. During the trial, even more disturbing details about the planning of my accident came to light through the testimony of the mechanic who had been coerced into sabotaging my brakes. He revealed that Carlos had spent weeks studying my routes, calculating the average speed in different sections, identifying the exact point where brake failure would cause a dramatic but theoretically controllable accident. The mechanic, now a protected witness for the prosecution, described with a trembling voice how Carlos had threatened his family if he didn't cooperate, showing photos of his children leaving school as a demonstration that he had the capacity to cause harm if his orders weren't followed. He said it was just to scare her, that the mother would be there to ensure nothing serious happened. The mechanic testified. But when I saw the news about the accident, I knew I had participated in something much worse than a simple scare. Carlos's defense tried to argue that he was the victim of a biased judicial system that criminalized consensual relationships between adults. But his argumentation completely fell apart when the prosecution presented recordings of intercepted calls where Carlos openly discussed with associates about the pathetic old women he was milking, and especially about his plans to flee the country as soon as he could pull off one more big score. A particularly damning recording captured Carlos laughing while describing how he had convinced Regina that I was being pursued by an imaginary criminal organization. "The stupid old woman believed everything," he said in the recording, his voice dripping with contempt. "She's so desperate to be important in her daughter's life that she would accept any story that turned her into a heroine." Regina had to testify via video conference from the psychiatric clinic, a moment that was simultaneously necessary for the case and devastating for our already fragile relationship. Seeing her describe in detail how she had been manipulated, how each of her maternal insecurities had been exploited, how her genuine love for me had been weaponized against both of us, was an experience that forced me to confront the complexity of being simultaneously victim and perpetrator. "I loved my daughter more than my own life," Regina testified, tears streaming down her face. "Carlos took that love and turned it into poison. He made me believe that hurting Sophia was saving her, that creating danger was creating protection. He inverted everything I knew about maternal love until I could no longer distinguish between protecting and destroying." The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation. Carlos was found guilty of all charges, including attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion through kidnapping, for cases where he had created false danger situations, and criminal association. The sentence was 35 years in prison without the possibility of parole for the first 20 years, one of the most severe sentences ever applied for crimes of this nature in the state. When the judge read the sentence, Carlos finally dropped the mask of charm he had maintained throughout the trial, exploding into a torrent of cursing and threats that had to be contained by multiple court officers. "You'll regret this. All of you, you pathetic old cows. I gave meaning to your miserable lives," he screamed as he was dragged out of the room, finally revealing the true face of the predator who had hidden behind seductive smiles. The post-trial period was marked by a careful and gradual attempt to rebuild some kind of relationship with Regina, not as mother and daughter in the traditional sense that had been irrevocably broken, but as two survivors of a shared trauma trying to find some kind of peace. Family therapy sessions continued, now focused on processing not just the immediate trauma of the accident and Carlos's manipulation, but decades of dysfunctional patterns that had made Regina vulnerable to this type of exploitation. "We need to understand that Regina's obsession with controlling Sophia didn't come from nowhere," Dr. Fernanda explained during a particularly revealing session. "It was built on her own insecurities, her fears of abandonment, her inability to see her daughter as a separate individual. Carlos simply identified these vulnerabilities and exploited them. During these sessions, Regina revealed aspects of her own childhood that I had never known. A distant mother who had abandoned her at 7, an authoritarian father who conditioned affection on absolute obedience, an adolescence marked by rejections that had created a pathological fear of abandonment. When you were born, I swore I would be different," she said during a particularly emotional session, "that I would never abandon you, never let you feel alone. But my fear of losing you made me suffocate you. And ironically, it was this suffocation that almost drove you away permanently. It was painful but necessary to understand that Regina's obsessive behavior had deep roots in her own unprocessed traumas, although this neither excused nor minimized the damage she had caused. The question of Regina's legal responsibility was resolved through a complex judicial agreement that recognized her dual role as perpetrator and victim. She received a suspended sentence conditioned on continued psychiatric treatment for at least 5 years, prohibition of unsupervised contact with me for the same period, and community service in organizations that support victims of financial and emotional manipulation. This court recognizes that Mrs. Regina Santos was systematically manipulated by a professional criminal, the judge declared during the sentencing hearing. However, this does not completely absolve her of responsibility for the choices she made. This agreement seeks to balance justice with compassion, punishment with the possibility of rehabilitation. Miguel and I began our own healing journey as a couple, participating in marriage counseling to process how the trauma had affected our relationship. The accident and its subsequent revelations had created a dynamic where Miguel felt responsible for constantly protecting me, while I struggled with feelings of vulnerability and loss of control. "You survived something extraordinary together," our therapist observed. But now you need to learn to live normally again, without the constant adrenaline of crisis, without the hypervigilance you developed as a protection mechanism. It was a slow and sometimes frustrating process, learning to relax again, to trust that the danger had passed, to not interpret every coincidence as a possible threat. 1 year after the accident, we made the decision to sell the house where we had lived and start over in a new city. It wasn't running away, but actively choosing an environment where we could build new memories without the constant triggers of trauma. The new house had a spacious garden where I began to cultivate a therapeutic garden, each plant representing an aspect of the healing journey. Miguel set up a home office where he could work while maintaining a comforting proximity, an arrangement that allowed us to process the temporary need for constant closeness without it becoming unhealthy codependency. During this period of reconstruction, I began writing about the experience, initially as a form of personal therapy, but gradually evolving into a broader project about family manipulation and romantic predators. The process of writing forced me to examine the events with some analytical distance, identifying the warning signs I had ignored, the patterns of manipulation that now seemed obvious in retrospect, and especially the specific vulnerabilities that Carlos had exploited in both Regina and indirectly in me. Writing about trauma isn't just retelling the story, my editor explained to me when the manuscript began to take the shape of a book. It's recontextualizing it, finding meaning in chaos, transforming pain into knowledge that can help others. The most revealing aspect of these conversations was discovering that almost all survivors struggled with the same question that tormented me: how to process the fact that someone who genuinely loved us had been capable of causing us so much harm. The answer, complex and painful, was that love and destruction are not mutually exclusive when filtered through manipulated or sick minds. Regina's love for me was real, but had been distorted through the prism of her own pathologies, and then weaponized by Carlos. Accepting this duality, that she simultaneously loved me and terribly hurt me, was essential for any kind of genuine healing. 2 years after the accident, Regina was discharged from psychiatric hospitalization, transitioning to intensive outpatient treatment. She moved to an assisted living apartment where she had independence but also access to constant psychological support. Our meetings remained limited to family therapy sessions, but gradually we began to have conversations that went beyond shared trauma. We talked about books we were reading, about world news, about anything except the elephant in the room that was our destroyed relationship. It was artificial and sometimes uncomfortable, but it was the beginning of something. Not necessarily reconciliation, but peaceful coexistence. "I don't expect your forgiveness," Regina told me during a particularly emotional session. "I understand that some things once broken cannot be fixed, but I hope that one day you can remember that there were times when I was a good mother, before all this." It was the first time she had verbalized acceptance that our relationship would never go back to what it was, and paradoxically, that acceptance opened space for something new. We were no longer mother and daughter in the traditional sense, but we were two women who had survived something terrible, each carrying different scars from the same traumatic event. The process of writing the book forced me to revisit repeatedly the most painful moments of the experience, but each revision brought new insights. I started to identify the early signs that I had ignored: the subtle changes in Regina's behavior when she began dating Carlos, how he would always appear in moments of conflict between us offering mediation, how he had gradually become the filter through which Regina interpreted all my actions. In retrospect, the pattern was clear. He had systematically positioned himself as the interpreter of reality for Regina, gradually distorting her perception until she lived in an alternative world where I was constantly in danger, and only dramatic gestures could save me. Miguel was my constant support throughout the writing and recovery process, but the trauma had also fundamentally changed our relationship. Where before there was lightness and spontaneity, now there was careful vigilance, a tendency to overanalyze each interaction, to look for hidden meanings in innocent comments. "Sometimes I feel like Carlos stole our innocence," Miguel confessed during a couples therapy session. "I can no longer accept people's kindness at face value. I'm always looking for the angle, the potential manipulation." It was a side effect of trauma that many survivors experience: the loss of the ability to trust instinctively, replaced by constant and exhausting analysis of motivations. The book launch, titled Weaponized Love: When Family Becomes a Predator's Tool, took place 3 years after the accident. The reception was more intense than I had anticipated, with hundreds of people sharing their own stories of family manipulation. The book inadvertently became a convergence point for survivors who had felt isolated in their experiences. thinking they were the only ones who had been betrayed in such complex and devastating ways. Book signing sessions frequently transformed into impromptu support groups, with people crying as they shared stories they had kept for years. Regina read the book, a decision that both she and her psychiatric team carefully considered before allowing. Her reaction was complex and took several therapy sessions to process. Seeing everything written like this, in such a clear and analytical way, made me understand how sick I was, she said. But it also helped me understand that I wasn't unique, that Carlos had done this to so many others. It doesn't diminish my responsibility, but it contextualizes my vulnerability. It was significant progress in her ability to maintain personal responsibility while also recognizing the external factors that had contributed to her actions. An unexpected development was the interest of academic researchers in the case, particularly those studying the intersection between dysfunctional family dynamics and vulnerability to external predators. I was invited to speak at conferences on forensic psychology, sharing not just my personal story, but the analytical insights I had developed through years of therapy and research. Sophia and Regina's case is paradigmatic, noted a professor of criminal psychology during one of these conferences. It shows how skilled predators can transform love, the most fundamental human emotion, into a weapon of destruction. During one of these lectures, I was confronted by a woman in the audience who aggressively questioned why I had abandoned my mother after everything. She was sick. She was manipulated. How can you simply cut ties with someone who gave you life? She asked, her voice heavy with judgment. It was a crucial moment to articulate something that had taken years to understand. I didn't abandon my mother, I replied. I established necessary boundaries for my survival. Love doesn't mean accepting destruction. Family isn't an excuse for abuse, even when that abuse comes from a place of illness or manipulation. Protecting myself wasn't cruelty. It was necessity. 5 years after the accident, Regina and I reached an arrangement that worked for both of us. Supervised monthly meetings in a neutral environment, usually a public cafe where the formality of the space kept interactions within safe boundaries. We talked about neutral subjects, books, movies, gardening, carefully avoiding the minefield of our shared history. It wasn't a mother-daughter relationship in the traditional sense, but it was something. An acknowledgement of our shared humanity, if not our family ties. During one of these coffees, Regina made an observation that surprised me with its clarity. You know, in a distorted way, Carlos gave me a gift, she said, thoughtfully stirring her tea. He forced me to confront who I really was, a woman so obsessed with control that she was willing to destroy what she loved most to maintain it. Without him, perhaps I would have continued with less but constant surveillance, destroying our relationship slowly rather than dramatically. At least this way there was a possibility of treatment, of real change. It was a disturbing but valid insight. Sometimes it takes a catastrophic crisis to reveal and treat pathologies that would otherwise continue causing chronic damage. The most lasting impact of the entire experience was a fundamental change in how I understood trust and love. I learned that trust should not be automatic, even with family. That true love includes respecting boundaries and autonomy. That shared vulnerability can be both strength and weakness, depending on with whom it is shared. These weren't lessons I had asked to learn, but they were lessons that now formed the basis of how I navigated all relationships. Miguel and I eventually renewed our marriage vows in a small, intimate ceremony, not to erase the trauma, but to acknowledge that we had survived and chosen to continue together despite it. I promise to love you not despite the scars, but including them, he said in his renewed vows. I promise to be your safe harbor without being your prison. I promise healthy vigilance without destructive paranoia. These were promises born from hard experience, more realistic and therefore more meaningful than naive vows of unconditional eternal love. The legal case against Carlos continued reverberating years later, with several of his previous victims managing to reopen cases that had been archived for lack of evidence. My testimony and Regina's were crucial in establishing his pattern of behavior, leading to additional convictions that ensured he would never be released. During one of the subsequent trials, I had the opportunity to confront him directly. You transformed my mother's love for me into poison, I said during my victim impact statement, but you failed to destroy either of us permanently. We are survivors, not your eternal victims. Carlos's response was revealing in its sociopathy. He smiled and said, I merely showed what was already there. The obsession, the control, the willingness to destroy in the name of love. I didn't create any of that. I just directed it. It was simultaneously horrifying and enlightening to hear him so casually admit that he had identified and exploited pre-existing vulnerabilities. It confirmed what years of therapy had taught me, that predators like Carlos were opportunists who looked for weaknesses to exploit, not creators of evil out of nothing. Today, almost a decade after that fateful day when my car spun out of control on that wet road, I can say that I have found not just peace, but purpose in the trauma. My work now includes advocacy for victims of family manipulation, consulting for organizations that work with survivors of psychological abuse, and primarily education about the warning signs of emotional predators. Each person I help to identify and escape from similar situations makes my own suffering less meaningless, transforming personal pain into collective prevention. Regina continues her treatment, now voluntarily beyond the mandatory period. She has herself become a voice of warning in support groups for older women, sharing her story as a caution about the dangers of letting untreated insecurities become exploitable vulnerabilities. I spent decades thinking that love meant control, that concern justified invasion, she says in these meetings. I almost killed my daughter trying to save her from imaginary dangers. If my story prevents even one mother from falling into the same trap, perhaps something good can come from all this horror. Our relationship will never be what it could have been in an alternative reality where she had sought help for her insecurities decades ago, where healthy boundaries had been naturally established, where Carlos had never crossed our paths. But within the limitations of our current reality, we've built something functional if not warm, respectful if not intimate. It's more than many survivors achieve, and for that, I am grateful. The therapeutic garden I started at the new house has become a sanctuary of healing, each plant marking a different stage of recovery. The roses represent the beauty that can grow despite the thorns of trauma. The succulents symbolize resilience and the ability to thrive with minimal care. The oak we planted in the center grows slowly but solidly, its deep roots representing the hard-won stability after chaos. It is a physical reminder that growth and healing are slow but constant processes, that even the most damaged soil can nurture new life with proper time and care. The nights still bring occasional nightmares. The sound of twisting metal, the vision of Regina's satisfied smile through the shattered windshield, Carlos's voice whispering poisonous manipulations. But now I know how to process these echoes of trauma, how to recognize them for what they are, memories, not omens. Miguel has developed a ritual of gently waking me from these nightmares, anchoring me in the present with his solid presence and gentle reminders that we are safe, that the danger has passed, that we survived. The financial impact of the entire situation took years to fully resolve. Although insurance eventually covered the accident damages after extensive investigations, the legal costs, ongoing therapy, and lost work during the most intense period of trauma created significant financial pressures. Ironically, the book's success helped recover some economic stability, transforming our victimization story into a resource for recovery. Carlos tried to destroy us financially through emotional manipulation, Miguel once observed. But we ended up recovering by transforming that manipulation into education for others. The online community that grew around the book has become a valuable resource for survivors globally. Moderated by mental health professionals, it offers a safe space for people to process their experiences, share resources, and most importantly, feel less isolated in traumas that society often has difficulty understanding. How do you explain to someone that your own mother tried to kill you to save you? Someone recently posted, echoing the impossibility of communicating our experience to those who haven't lived through something similar. Regina occasionally contributes to the community, always with supervision from her therapeutic team. Her insights from the perpetrator-victim side are valuable, though painful. I want them to understand how the manipulated mind works, she wrote in a particularly impactful post. How each small concession to the distortion of reality paves the way for larger concessions. How love becomes justification for unthinkable acts. How the need to be needed can become stronger than the need to not cause harm. Her words help others understand their own manipulated family members, creating the possibility of compassion without enabling. My advocacy work has led me to testify in legislative hearings about the need for stronger laws against psychological manipulation and emotional abuse. Carlos's case has become a cited example in law proposals that specifically criminalize the creation of false danger situations to establish psychological control. We cannot wait for victims to die to recognize attempted murder disguised as love, I argued in a particularly important hearing. The law needs to evolve to recognize that psychological violence can be as destructive as physical violence. An unexpected but welcome development was the interest from academic institutions in using our case as a study to train future psychologists, social workers, and criminal justice professionals. Participating in these educational sessions, answering questions from students who will be the next generation of professionals helping survivors, gives additional meaning to the trauma. You aren't just studying a case, I always remind students. You're learning to recognize and interrupt cycles of abuse that destroy entire families. The question I receive most often, both in lectures and private messages, is about forgiveness. Have you forgiven your mother? Have you forgiven yourself for not seeing the signs earlier? The answer constantly evolves. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't binary. It's not a switch that turns on or off. It's an ongoing process of releasing anger while maintaining boundaries, of understanding without excusing, of moving forward without forgetting the lessons learned. I've forgiven Regina enough to not let anger consume me, but not enough to lower guards that protect me. I've forgiven myself for not recognizing the signs, understanding that victims aren't responsible for their victimization. The 10th anniversary of the accident approaches, and with it comes reflections on the journey traveled. From victim of a murder attempt disguised as heroic rescue, I've become an educator, advocate, and survivor who helps others survive. From daughter suffocated by obsessive love, I've become a woman who understands the difference between healthy love and control disguised as care. From a person who almost died in a fabricated accident, I've become someone who lives intentionally, aware that each day free from manipulation and control is a victory. Regina, now 75, remains stable in her treatment. Our monthly meetings continue, slowly evolving from tense formality to something approaching genuine cordiality. In a recent conversation, she mentioned she's writing her own memoirs, not for publication, but as a therapeutic exercise. I need to understand my own story so I don't repeat it, she explained. I need to trace how I became someone capable of hurting those I loved most. It's a painful but necessary project, and I support her efforts while maintaining distance from the process. The most important legacy of this entire experience is the increased awareness about how emotional predators operate, how they identify and exploit family vulnerabilities, how they weaponize love. Each person who recognizes signs of manipulation because of our story, each family that seeks help before the situation becomes catastrophic, each predator who is thwarted because their potential victims are educated, this transforms our particular trauma into universal prevention. Sometimes, in quiet moments in the garden, I allow myself to imagine the alternative life where none of this happened, where Regina sought therapy decades ago for her insecurities, where we naturally established healthy boundaries, where Carlos never entered our lives. It would be a simpler life, certainly, but not necessarily more meaningful. The trauma broke us, yes, but in rebuilding we became stronger, wiser, more capable of helping others. It's not the life we would choose, but it's the life we have, and we've found ways to make it meaningful despite, or perhaps because of, the pain that shaped it. Therapy continued to be an essential part of my routine for years, evolving from crisis sessions to preventative maintenance of mental health. Dr. Ana Lucia helped me understand that the healing process wasn't linear. There would be days when I'd feel completely recovered, followed by moments when the trauma would resurface with devastating force, usually triggered by seemingly innocent coincidences like the sound of screeching brakes or the sight of a blonde 60-year-old woman driving a white SUV. Trauma lives in the body as much as in the mind, she explained during particularly difficult sessions. Your nervous system has been reprogrammed to detect danger where it doesn't necessarily exist. Part of healing is teaching your body that it's safe again, that not every mother is a predator, that not every gesture of help hides ulterior motives. Regina continued her psychiatric treatment with dedication that surprised even her doctors. The letters she occasionally sent through her therapists, always read and approved by them before sending, showed gradual but genuine evolution in her ability to take responsibility without falling into paralyzing self-pity. I spend my days trying to understand how I became someone capable of hurting my own daughter, she wrote in a particularly touching letter. The doctors say it's a combination of unresolved traumas, personality disorders, and mainly my inability to see you as a person separate from me. Carlos simply found these cracks in my psyche and transformed them into abysses. The impact of the book when it was finally published exceeded all expectations. Within weeks, I received hundreds of messages from people who had experienced similar family manipulations, many discovering for the first time that they weren't alone in their traumas too bizarre to be believed. A 50-year Old woman wrote to me about how her father had been convinced by a girlfriend to sabotage her marriage through false accusations of child abuse. A man described how his mother had been manipulated into stealing his identity and incurring debts in his name to support a boyfriend addicted to gambling. Each story confirmed that predators like Carlos were much more common than society would like to admit, and that dysfunctional families were fertile ground for this type of exploitation. The lectures and workshops I began to conduct became a natural extension of advocacy work. Universities, victim support centers, psychology conferences. There was constant demand for education about how predators identify and exploit family vulnerabilities. I developed a protocol for identifying warning signs that was adopted by various support organizations. The first sign is always isolation, I explained in presentations. The predator works to separate the primary victim from their support networks, but subtly, making it seem like it's the victim's own choice. Then comes reality distortion. Small lies that the relationship with Regina evolved into something that defied traditional categorization. We weren't mother and daughter in the conventional sense, but we weren't strangers either. We were two survivors of the same predator, each carrying different types of scars. Our monthly supervised meetings had evolved into bi-weekly video conversations, always with a therapist present but with increasing naturalness. We talked about books, movies, current events, anything except the past that defined us and the future we would never traditionally share. During one of these conversations, Regina made an observation that surprised me with its psychological depth. You know what's most cruel about what Carlos did? He didn't just use me to hurt you. He ensured that even if you completely forgave me, we could never have a normal relationship because there would always be the ghost of what happened between us. He didn't just destroy our present, he annihilated all possible futures too. It was a painful but liberating truth to recognize. The ongoing work with survivors exposed me to an increasingly broad spectrum of family manipulations. I met men whose fathers had been convinced to sabotage their businesses, teenagers whose grandparents had been manipulated into trying to get custody through false accusations, siblings turned against each other by manipulative partners. Each story added nuance to my understanding of how family vulnerabilities could be exploited. I developed a taxonomy of family predators that became a valuable resource for mental health professionals and law enforcement. The foundation expanded significantly, now operating in multiple states with a team of dedicated professionals. We established a scholarship program for therapists to specialize in family manipulation trauma, recognizing that there was a desperate need for professionals who understood the unique complexities of this type of abuse. The mentoring program for adolescents in difficult family situations had helped dozens of young people recognize and escape toxic dynamics before they became entrenched. Regina, now 80, remained surprisingly lucid and committed to her accountability process. She had begun writing her own memoir, not for public publication, but as a document for mental health professionals to study. I want them to understand how a seemingly normal mother can become a weapon in the hands of a predator, she explained. I want them to see the signs that I myself couldn't see. If my story can help identify and treat other mothers before they cause harm, perhaps my life will have some meaning beyond the destruction I caused. A particularly powerful moment occurred when I was invited to speak at an international conference on psychological violence. In the audience, I recognized a woman who had contacted me years before. Her mother had tried to slowly poison her to keep her sick and dependent, an extreme case of Munchausen by proxy that had been partially inspired by Carlos's case of creating danger only to save. After my talk, she approached me with tears in her eyes. "Your book saved my life," she said. It made me realize that my constant illness wasn't coincidence. I got toxicology tests and discovered arsenic. My mother is in prison now, but I'm alive thanks to you. Moments like these made all the advocacy work worthwhile, transforming my personal trauma into prevention and salvation for others. But they were also heavy reminders of the disturbing prevalence of family abuse masked as love. For every case that came to light, how many remained in the shadows, with victims suffering in silence because society refuses to believe that mothers can harm children in such calculated ways. The 20th anniversary of the accident was approaching, and with it came an unexpected proposal, a documentary about our case and its impact on legislation and awareness of family manipulation. The producers wanted to include interviews with Regina, other victims of Carlos, forensic psychology experts, and mainly wanted to recreate some key events. The decision to participate was agonizing. It meant revisiting the trauma in an even more public and visual way, but it also offered an opportunity to reach an audience that books and lectures couldn't reach. Regina agreed to participate in the documentary with strict conditions about how she would be portrayed. "I don't want to be shown as a pure victim or as a one-dimensional monster," she insisted. "I want them to show the complexity, how someone can genuinely love and still cause terrible harm, how predators identify and exploit this kind of distorted love." Her participation added a layer of depth that elevated the documentary beyond simple true crime to a nuanced exploration of dysfunctional family psychology. The filming was emotionally exhausting. Returning to the curve where the accident happened, now reformed with better safety barriers, was a surreal experience. The director, sensitive to the trauma he was asking us to revisit, allowed multiple breaks and had therapists on set. The recreation of the accident moment, using stunt doubles and special effects, made me vomit from anxiety even knowing it was fictional. But there was also something cathartic about seeing the event from the outside, as an observer rather than a victim. The most powerful moment of the documentary was a filmed meeting between me and Regina, the first unsupervised one in almost 2 decades. We sat in a neutral room, cameras discreetly positioned, and talked honestly about what we had lost and what, surprisingly, we had gained. "I hate that it took something so terrible for me to seek treatment," Regina said, looking directly at me for the first time in years. "But without the trauma, I would have continued slowly suffocating you until you cut me off completely, or I died still trying to control you." I responded with equal honesty. "I hate that you were weaponized against me. I hate that Carlos identified and exploited your unhealthy love for me. But I also recognize there were deep problems in our relationship long before he appeared. He merely transformed chronic dysfunction into acute crisis." The documentary was released with significant impact, winning awards and, more importantly, generating necessary conversations about the boundaries of family love and the possibility of abuse even in supposedly sacred relationships. We received messages from hundreds of people who finally understood that their own family traumas were valid, that they weren't exaggerating or being dramatic about subtle manipulations they had experienced. An unexpected outcome of the documentary was interest from academic institutions in establishing formal programs to study family manipulation. A prestigious university created a research chair specifically focused on predators who exploit family vulnerabilities. I was invited as a consultant, helping to develop curriculum that would be taught to future psychologists, social workers, and criminal justice professionals. Regina, inspired by the documentary's impact, proposed her own project, a program where victims like herself could share their experiences with potential victims and their families. "Who better to explain how predators operate than someone who was manipulated by one?" she argued. The program, carefully structured with extensive psychological supervision, allowed people like Regina to offer unique insight into manipulation processes from the perspective of someone who had been both tool and victim. Miguel developed a parallel organization focused on partners of family trauma victims. He created specific resources for people navigating the complex terrain of supporting someone traumatized while processing their own secondary trauma. "Partners often feel guilty about having their own feelings about the trauma," he explained in his workshops. "But anger, frustration, exhaustion, all are valid. You cannot effectively support someone if you're not taking care of your own mental health." As I approached 50, almost 20 years after the accident, I reflected on the person I had become through trauma. I wasn't who I had planned to be, the successful architect with a traditional family life I had imagined at 30. Instead, I was a survivor-turned-advocate, a daughter without a traditional mother who had found chosen family, a woman whose greatest achievement wasn't professional, but the transformation of personal trauma into meaningful social change. Regina, now needing more intensive care due to age, moved to a specialized care facility. Our meetings became less frequent, but more meaningful. In one particularly memorable visit, she gifted me something unexpected. The ring she had worn during Carlos's manipulation period, the same one that had been crucial evidence in the case. "I kept this as a reminder of what I'm capable of doing when I'm not vigilant about my own mind," she explained. "Now I want you to have it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that we survived, both of us." The ring now sits in a glass box in my office, along with other artifacts of trauma, pages from Regina's diary from that time, trial transcripts, the first edition of my book. They are not relics of victimization, but evidence of survival, physical proof that it's possible to transform the most destructive experiences into forces for positive change. One of the most gratifying developments was seeing the next generation of professionals incorporating our lessons into their practice. Young therapists sought me out for supervision in complex cases of family manipulation. Lawyers cited our case in legal arguments, Researchers built upon our work to develop better identification and intervention protocols. The trauma that had threatened to destroy me had become a foundation for protecting others. During a recent Foundation event, a young woman approached with her mother. They had used our resources to escape from a stepfather who had manipulated the mother into psychologically abusing her daughter. "You saved us," the mother said, crying. "I was so blind, so manipulated, but the Foundation's resources helped me see what was happening and get help before it was too late." Seeing a mother who had managed to break the cycle of manipulation before causing irreparable harm was deeply healing, proof that our work was preventing future versions of our own tragedy. Regina passed away peacefully in her sleep in the spring of the 22nd year after the accident. Her caregiver called me early in the morning, and the news hit me with emotional complexity that I had anticipated but couldn't fully prepare for. It wasn't traditional grief for the loss of a mother. That grief I had processed decades before. It was something more complicated. Relief that her suffering had ended, sadness for the relationship we never had a chance to have, and strangely, gratitude that she had lived long enough to make some reparation, even if incomplete. The funeral was small and discreet, attended only by a few distant relatives, her care team, and surprisingly, some of the women from her support group. Each shared how Regina had helped them recognize toxic patterns in their own maternal behaviors. "She saved my relationship with my daughter," an elderly lady testified. "She made me see that I was repeating the same mistakes, just on a smaller scale." In her will, Regina left the little she had to the Foundation, along with all her writings about the experience. But most significant was a final letter to me, written with a shaky hand but clear mind. "Sophia, I don't ask for forgiveness because I know some things are unforgivable, but I thank you for surviving despite me, for transforming my worst act into strength for good. You became the extraordinary woman you are not because of me, but in spite of me. And paradoxically, that fills me with pride I have no right to feel. Go in peace, my daughter. You are finally free." I read the letter in the therapeutic garden, surrounded by the plants I had cultivated as symbols of recovery. Miguel was by my side, holding my hand as I cried, not from sadness, but from release. The last link in the chain that had bound me to trauma had been gently cut. Regina was dead. Carlos had died years before, and I was alive, thriving, helping others. The attempt to imprison me through manufactured gratitude had completely failed. In the months after Regina's death, I experienced a psychological freedom I hadn't felt before. Even with all the boundaries and distances I had established, there had always been the weight of knowing she was somewhere, carrying our shared history. Now, it was just my story to tell, shape, and use as I chose. I decided to write a second book. This one focused not on the trauma itself, but on the long journey of rebuilding that came after. The new book, After the Accident, 2 Decades of Rebuilding, offered a practical roadmap for survivors navigating the complex years following family trauma. It included contributions from Miguel about the partner's perspective, insights from professionals who had treated us, and even excerpts from Regina's writings about her own process of confronting what she had done. It was less sensational than the first book, but more helpful for people on the long and arduous journey of recovery. Miguel and I decided to make a big change, sell everything and travel, taking our advocacy work globally. We discovered that family manipulation transcended cultures, manifesting in different but equally destructive ways around the world. We established partnerships with international organizations, adapting our resources for different cultural contexts. In each country, we found versions of our story. Parents used against children, siblings turned against each other, grandparents weaponized. During a conference in Japan, I met a survivor whose experience mirrored mine in a disturbing way. Her mother had been manipulated into causing an accident from which she heroically saved her. The universality of these patterns confirmed what we had suspected. Predators like Carlos existed in every society, exploiting the same basic human vulnerabilities, only adapting their tactics to specific cultural norms. The 25th anniversary of the accident was marked with the launch of a permanent research center dedicated to the study of family manipulation and emotional predation. Funded by donations from successful survivors and government grants, the center would become a global hub for research, treatment, and prevention. The plaque at the entrance bore Regina's quote, "Love without boundaries is not love. It's obsession waiting to be weaponized." During the opening ceremony, I looked at the audience, survivors, therapists, researchers, justice officials, all united by the common purpose of preventing future tragedies. Miguel was by my side, his hair now grayer, but his eyes still full of the same love and determination that had sustained me through the worst moments. I realized that we had accomplished the impossible, transforming an attempt at psychological imprisonment into an expansive freedom that benefited thousands. In my opening speech, I shared a reflection that had taken years to articulate. Carlos tried to transform me into a perpetual prisoner of manufactured gratitude. Regina, manipulated and sick, was the tool he used. But in the end, they both failed. Not because they were weak, but because they underestimated human resilience. They underestimated our capacity to transform poison into medicine, trauma into triumph. Every person we help, every predator we stop, every family we protect. This is our revenge. Not through destruction, but through prevention and healing. The center included a residential wing for victims needing safe refuge, a clinic for specialized treatment, a library with resources in multiple languages, and most importantly, a training program for professionals. The first class included 50 people from 20 different countries, each committed to bringing knowledge about family manipulation to their communities. It was a legacy that neither Carlos nor Regina could have imagined emerging from their destructive acts. Today, almost 3 decades after that fateful day on the wet road, I can honestly say that I am grateful. Not for the trauma, never for the trauma, but for the person I became through it, for the lives I saved because of it, for the love I learned to give and receive despite it. Miguel and I built an extraordinary life on the foundation of tragedy, proving that even the most diabolical attempts at destruction can become seeds of profound transformation. The original therapeutic garden still flourishes, now part of the research center, open to all survivors who need physical space to process their journeys. The oak tree at the center has grown strong and tall, its deep roots and wide branches offering shade for others to rest in their own healing journeys. Sometimes I sit under it, closing my eyes and allowing myself to momentarily imagine an alternative reality where none of this happened. But then I open my eyes and see the reality we created, one where trauma became purpose, where pain became prevention, where an attempt at imprisonment became a movement of liberation. Regina was right about one thing in her final letter. I was finally free. Not just from the trauma, not just from her, but free to define my own narrative, create my own meaning, transform scars into signposts for others to find their way out of their own psychological prisons. The mother who tried to save me to imprison me ended up, through her failure, freeing me in ways neither of us could have foreseen. And so ends this story. Not with perfect resolution, not with complete forgiveness or miraculous reconciliation, but with something more honest and more useful. Transformation. From victim to survivor to advocate, from betrayed daughter to empowered woman, from near tragedy to imperfect but meaningful triumph. Carlos is dead, Regina is dead, but the work continues, lives continue being saved, and love, true love that respects boundaries and celebrates autonomy, continues winning over control, disguised as care. Did you like Sophia's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.